Um, Dana asks, was Romans originally Hebrew? I'm assuming that you're speaking about the book of Romans. Um, I don't think we have any evidence that the book of Romans was actually written in Hebrew. Now, we know that Paul spoke Hebrew. How do we know that? Well, we just have to go back to the book of Acts. We go back to Acts chapter 22, and Paul is giving his defense of what happened to him. And he says, um, and when they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. Then he said, all right, he says, I'm a Jew, born of Tarsus of Cilicia. So he speaks in Hebrew. Now, some people say, well, he was speaking in the language of the temple. But let's be realistic about this. He's now giving a defense for his life, essentially. Is he going to do it in an archaic, old, dead language, or is he going to use it in the vernacular of his day, in that place, to really get to their heart, so that he can, give the best defense possible? Well, of course, he's going to do it in his mother tongue, which is Hebrew. Now, something that was a little different back then than, let's say, modern America is that many people actually spoke several languages. I know that's sometimes hard to believe because quite often, and I'm being a little bit facetious here, but more often than not, Americans tend to speak one language. But you go to many other parts of the world, and it's not uncommon to speak fluently 3 languages, 4 languages. If you go to parts of Africa, 7 languages is not at all uncommon. And you might speak all 7 in one day, right? So I'm just being a little bit facetious, but I want you to understand that speaking many languages was very, very possible, and speaking them well. So Paul is speaking Hebrew. These guys are kind of excited about that. They're silent when they hear that he's speaking Hebrew. Like, oh wow, this guy knows Hebrew. That's pretty cool. All right, and so then he says that he heard a voice speaking to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So that voice that he hears when he has this experience, um, then he shares what actually happened in that time. And Jesus um, speaks to him in the Hebrew language. All right, so he speaks to him in the Hebrew language, and that is very, very significant that Jesus would actually speak in the Hebrew tongue. Where do we have that? Well, it is in, um, I hate to have all these memorized, but it's in, again, in the book of Acts. I'm thinking it's chapter 24, where Paul once again is giving an account of where he had this experience on the road to Damascus. And so, because of that, we see that Jesus speaks to Paul in Hebrew. Paul speaks to the citizens in Jerusalem in Hebrew, and therefore we're quite confident that Paul spoke really good Hebrew, and this was one of his languages. So, with that in mind, when we come to the book of Romans, was the book of Romans written in Hebrew? Well, I think that it could have been, but I don't believe that we have any evidence that it was actually written in Hebrew. We have very clear evidence that it was written in Greek. Why? Because we have the Greek manuscript before us. Secondly, Paul is addressing this to the people in Rome. Now, I'm sure a few people in Rome knew Hebrew, but the vast majority in Rome would have been speaking Latin as their first tongue, but also many of them would have been speaking Greek. Okay, you have to keep in mind that Greek was essentially what English is today. All right, so for example, I could write to a congregation in India, but I could write to them in English and they would be great to understand it and receive it, because the language is good for me because I speak that. And the language is good for them because they speak it too, even though they have another language, right? And English, of course, is the language that if I want to get my message out to the most amount of people possible without translating, English is the way to go. And that is what Greek was back then. Now, give it a couple hundred years, and eventually, probably around the 4th century, is when we're going to see a transition from Greek being the language of communication, the language of commerce, the language of literature, and it's going to switch to Latin. And that's when we have the translation of the Latin Vulgate, and Jerome does that, and so he, of course, puts it in the Latin language. But until that time, Greek was the predominant language of the ancient world. So I don't think that we have any evidence. There's none that I know. I've never heard of any manuscripts ever being found in Hebrew. And of course, when it comes to these kind of questions, we have to say, okay, what's the evidence? It's fun to speculate that maybe it was written in Hebrew, but that's all it is speculation. But the evidence that we have is that it was written in Greek. So thank you. Good question.